What are we reading? I am happy not to be a web developer anymore. Curious. I mean, I have high hopes for this, but we'll see. I wrote my first single-page web app in JavaScript in 2005, right after learning about XML, HTTP requests, and before any serious frameworks existed. I left professional web development behind around 2009. I started in 1997 with web objects. That sounds absolutely crazy. And spent the final decade of my career doing mobile. Look at the world of web development today and it's mind-boggling how insane it is. Definitely true, absolutely. There are so many web frameworks with new ones appearing every day, building a web application as opposed to a website. This is an interesting distinction actually, that he considers. He's drawing a line between he was making websites while people now are making web applications. So they're actually, the web is only a delivery mechanism for your application. It's your runtime, which is interesting. Which is steadily generated and has only a little JavaScript. It often requires myriad of tools and technologies which often change at a high frequency, feature endless amounts of other technologies you usually don't even know are there. Yeah. The package directory, I don't even know what a package directory. I guess he means like the package manager. Or maybe it says JavaScript package directory or something. And that is 2,000 items. JavaScript is a terrible language that was never designed for any of this. Absolutely true. Yet oddly it became popular because it was always there. It's amazing how much innovation has gone into building out today's web development universe despite the somewhat shaky foundation it's built upon. I mean, it's not even just somewhat shaky, but you know, I believe the original JavaScript was even it's like it in this way it's kind of a good hack in that you could have comments on an HTML document, and the guy who created JavaScript made like, oh, I'll have a comment, but then I'll put special code in my browser that can read the comment and do special things and like animate the web page. So that's shaky foundations indeed. My first mobile job at an online travel company, now sadly just a brand. The web team evaluating... Oh, in my first job, okay, he's evaluating frameworks. In the end, they picked what they thought would work best, yet a year later the open source framework was mostly abandoned. Thankfully, it didn't matter since our brand had been sold and all technology in the entire company were gone. Well, I mean, I guess lucky that you disbanded the company. It's interesting, this idea that, oh, I use something and then it might be abandoned. I think the opposite is more interesting, is why do we have this idea that I have to use something which is maintained, as opposed to, I believe I was using Void Linux for a long time, and they had this interesting situation where one of the interesting things about Void Linux is it's got this different system D replacement. And I think it was considered unmaintained. So like the fundamental reason for this distro existing, that piece of software is unmaintained. But since it was, something that just had to do a certain job, it actually didn't matter because it didn't need constant work. And so the distro could continue, people, updating packages, whatever. And lots of people use Void Linux still today. Well, I think it still is technically unmaintained, although somebody may have taken up that job. But yeah, so maybe the real question is, why should the software need to be maintained? because this company clearly felt that, I mean, I guess in the web world, it's that things are always moving so fast, as in breaking for arbitrary reasons, that if their web framework they're using isn't keeping up, isn't treading water, so to speak, with the whole rest of the ecosystem, then you'll drown as soon as it stops being maintained. Which obviously that sounds like a bad way to do things. Yeah, today I can't even imagine how many choices there are to pick from, with new ones always appearing. Some of them are entire ecosystems, and often you choose one and then changing becomes impossible. The company investment is too significant. As a programmer, you become attached to one, and switching can become difficult, as employers often want people with experience in their chosen ecosystem. Yet specializing in one could put you in a different spot in your career if it becomes obsolete or even abandoned. There's a separate thing, which is here we get Conway's law over time. So Conway's law is that, you know, if I'm making a small piece of software and maybe I'm the only person working on it, well, since it's all in my head, this piece of software can take the arbitrary form that it needs to take. But as soon as we start breaking things up into teams, say to design a car, we make the decision early on, okay, tires, we presume, have nothing to do with the engine. And so we'll have a team that works on tires and a team that works on engines. And this basically means that, or Conway's law is that you can always see the org structure of you can see the org chart of the organization that made the piece of software in the piece of software itself. So for you know, if you use Windows, for example, you can see that there's the old control panel menu and there's the new settings, and these are representative of the old team that worked on something and the new team. But you also get this thing, so you can extend this to, I want to say chronological, but that wouldn't quite be correct. Probably chronic Conway's law, which is that your end product, if you keep working on a product, you have Conway's law, but it applies over time. So each group who worked on the product are still in there. And in this case, it applies to web frameworks, right? You keep switching web frameworks, but each different web framework like hangs around in a bit of a code. So you can tell from looking at the code when different parts were made, because they're using different frameworks that were cool at the time. I remember the first 2 single-page apps I built. It was fun, and I needed very little to build them beyond a text editor and a browser. Getting data did involve a little marshalling framework and some Java code. It's pretty cool that he was using Java and not JavaScript. The architecture board I was part of complained that I had bought some unapproved technology until I spent a lot of time showing them that it was just the browser and JavaScript. Oh wow, so I guess they were impressed. My customers, internal only app, liked that they could search for information quickly as if it was a desktop app instead of constantly reloading the page. Wow, it's almost like you shipped an application and that was useful. These were not huge applications like Gmail, of course. Today, unless you are a tiny team building small apps, you probably invest in picking an ecosystem like React, Angular, or Vue, or combining smaller frameworks with other tools to roll your own environment. You must worry about CSS frameworks. I've never heard of this in my entire life. A CSS framework. That's crazy. Okay, guess that's the thing. asset packers and assemblers, okay, and many other open source frameworks and utilities, which are built on layers of yet more open source items. Now you must keep everything updated and avoid incompatibilities and security holes. Well, yeah, you aren't succeeding in that regard, so you know, better hope it's secure enough. What a pain in the ass all of this has to be. Of course, it's job security. Or is it? I guess we'll see over the next 10 years. Programming when I started in the early 80s was more straightforward, as you needed to know the programming language, the operating system, and what you were asked to build. Everything else you had to invent for yourself. I remember what a big deal it was for Trapeze, a spreadsheet-like application we shipped in January 1987. Very cool. When we got a copy of Lex and Yak from a friend with access to Unix to make our own formula parser with. Today, most everything you need is available somewhere in open source form, yet it might not. It might become unsupported and suffer from bugs you might not know about and become incompatible with another open source item you need. Yeah, I mean, he's highlighting all the correct problems. It's a shame. In a way, you have to forgive. In 1987, this is like early programming, relatively early. So we can forgive the guy for using Lex and Yak in this case, but you know, especially since knowledge is harder to come by today. I mean, even back then, you could have probably done a way better job with a go left sometimes parser for, I mean, you're passing formulas, so that doesn't sound that hard actually, because you just, yeah, whatever. I say this as a compiler developer. Many of the established ways of doing things that we still have around, or they're taught because they were cool in the 80s and 90s, are actually not the good way to do things. And that includes Lex and Yak. Lex and Yak is, I mean, Lex is crazy. The fact that they use Lex is crazy. Lex is like, it's either a library or basically a full program. It's a tool you use to define what your tokens are, and then it will automatically pass the tokens for you. Do so-called lexical analysis. But doing that kind of thing is the easiest task. It's literally, you have a for loop, you're going through the characters, and you say, oh, I see a number. Okay, that means the next token is going to be a number, a number literal. Okay, keep looking ahead, and as long as it keeps being numbers, well, they're a part of the same number. And then when I see something that's not a number, that means I'm finished with this token. Put that on an array. Keep going. Oh, what's the next thing? Oh, it's a space. Okay, skip that. There's a plus. Great. That's the plus operator. Put that token. Go. Oh, there's a space. Oh, I see. There's another number now, etc. So it's the most basic code, and yet they felt like they had to use an external tool, which is pretty crazy. Yak is maybe, I've never used Yak, so I can't really describe exactly what it does. I only know that it's bad and you shouldn't use it, and that served me very well. The final large project I shipped at my last job had no open source elements. It was all pure Swift. Our legal department was hard to please, and it was easier to build everything ourselves than deal with them. I can imagine that sounds very smart. It's not that you can't build complex things and maintain them with today's web framework ecosystems. I mean, I'd argue you barely can do that, but sure. Still, it can't be much fun. I wonder how applications will evolve given that ecosystems are constantly changing. People still use and support COBOL programs almost as old as I am, so anything is possible. I wonder if AI will eventually be able to deal with the constant churn in infinite layers of your web environment, or will give up and do humanity in? Well, I mean, this is not worth commenting on. Judge, strike that from the record. Speculation. Programming has always changed, and change is hard to adapt to. I have always specialized in building new things instead of maintaining old ones, often in companies or industries where new markets or technologies require new applications. I cannot remember ever dealing with so many new technologies that are constantly evolving and continuously having to imagine where they will be next year, much less the next decade. He made a mistake here. New technologies, okay? Article gets a strike. They're not technologies. A technology is a new technique, piece of techne that extends your abilities, that increases your leverage or your ability to do something somehow. Okay, making a library is not technology. That's not new technology. New technology is like, oh, we figured out how to make the special tiles on the SpaceX rocket so that it can be a reusable heat shield, because that's not been done before. Sorry, rapidly reusable, right? That's technology. Or technology would be, I figured out this new technique to do fast compilers. Like I figured out Sea of Nodes, for example. Sea of Nodes would count as a compiler technology. But making all these JavaScript libraries are not technologies. But maybe you have to call them technologies. Maybe we call them technologies so that we feel better about ourselves. Yeah, so security is a huge issue today, absolutely true, which is not the case in the first half of my career. Someone has to worry about all of this and make choices that will not cause issues, perhaps years later. How long would the applications you write today have to live with the same source code using the frameworks you picked initially? This is true, although I guess if you're building web servers and stuff, then you have more of an immediate security concern because your application is wired up to important databases. But otherwise, I mean, for most, if you wanted to make an application that does something useful, I don't think you need to worry about security most of the time. If you ran a sane operating system that sandboxed programs heavily by default, which, like the one I'm building here, you can read about it at samishsmith.com/Serenum. But given that, even if you were using Serenum, if you're building an interesting server, you need to worry about security anyway. But I honestly don't know how much. I'd be a little bit confused too. I can understand, like, oh, my encryption library, that's providing some serious functionality. But I don't understand how you use a framework for like a server that is doing significant work. But maybe I'm just uneducated. The application I started in 1988, Deltagraph, that's a cool name, survived on the same source code for 30 years. My team only worked on it for 5 years, before the pandemic killed the last company that sold it. Ultimately, it no longer ran on macOS as the quarter-century-old C code could not be updated to 64-bit. Oh, that's actually pretty wild. That's very impressive. I had no idea in 1988 that the decisions I made back then would impact someone 3 decades later. Yeah, gosh. The main web application from my last employer was an amalgamation of way too many technologies that made little sense when I first saw it. Again, strike technologies, write libraries. I wonder if many web apps these days will become piles of primordial ooze over time. People hate rewriting large things, but the cost of supporting the unsupportable eventually becomes too high. Another blog post to be coming soon. With web applications built on massive piles of constantly changing technologies, I wonder if the pile will ever eventually collapse. Well, you know, I happen to be working very hard to try bring about that collapse. You can check it out at samhsmith.com/Serenum, but that it would certainly take a while. Maybe AI will eventually take. I don't care about that. AI, whatever. It's not that I don't believe in AI. It's just anybody who says something AI programming, you can just you can predict with high accuracy that what's being said will not be of any interest. Programming to make art is almost like returning to the 1980s for me. I don't use many open source packages beyond Swift math libraries, and most of the code I write is not something you would find anywhere. Besides the occasional Xcode and Swift version releases, I am mostly insulated from massive changes. The most irritating thing is adding features to my site generator and website, where I get a little indication of the complexity in keeping things updated. But it's not my everyday job. I don't envy today's web developers' the task of keeping up with constant change and evolution, security, and the occasional left pad bomb. Not sure what that is. Even dealing with GitHub is becoming irritating. That I agree with. How many web-related frameworks are there today? You can't answer, as the count just changed. Very true, very true. And yeah, it's weird, this idea that you would. Okay, if we imagine that the library writer did a good job with the library, and they released you a finished product, which was this library. The things that actually come to mind for me for something like this is GLFW. Okay, GLFW, if you use GLFW2 as a dependency for your game or something, you lock in a specific version of GLFW, and you have the same, you check that version in and use it all the way through development, and then release many years later. And even though there is GLFW 3, you don't upgrade unless you say, I need something from the new version of GLFW, because the old version of GLFW keeps doing the same task. So you just use the same lib. And so really, if it's a good library, why would you need to update? For all my stuff, even this is more like personal libraries. I make personal libraries for myself, but then when I use the library in some program I'm making, I copy the source code of the library and check that into source control on this other sub project. And then I'll like make changes and update the library, and I won't propagate these to the other program, because that other program shouldn't be receiving the updates unless I then go work on that program and I say, oh yeah, let me pull the new version of this lib and fix up the differences. Because if I don't update the library, then the library does the same thing, and I can just keep compiling it. I never break anything by working on the main library. A technique I would recommend, although you will have to figure out where it fits you in the work you do. Anyway, with that, I wish you a good evening, and I'll see you in the next video.